Welcome back. You're listening to the panel discussion, Information Sharing from Compliance to Defense, sponsored by Viasat on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM. I'm your host, Jason Miller. My guests today are Denise Anderson, the Executive Director of the National Health Information Sharing and Analysis Center, Karen Evans, the National Director of the U.S. Cyber Challenge, Brad Nix, the Deputy Director of the Homeland Security Department's U.S. CERT, Todd Ratcliffe, the Section Chief of Cyber Operations Division for the FBI, and Jerry Goodwin, the Chief Operating Officer of the Government Systems Group at Viasat. Before break, we got into the liability conversation. We got into a little bit of excitement, if you will, for a panel. And one of the things about liability is the idea that how companies, how organizations are viewing the liability side. So since, Jerry, you are a representative of that group, talk a little bit about how you're viewing liability as it relates to the bidirectional.
Yeah, I think this is a real issue, and the CISO legislation should help this some. I think there's a couple of aspects to it. One aspect is, if you're doing what you know to do, and you're trying to protect your networks, and say you're a public company, you're trying to protect your networks, then and you're trying to share information about what's going on, per the CISO legislation, there should be some protection. On the other hand, if you're not being diligent, then maybe it's not the best thing to just have this blanket protection. But companies already have hesitancy or reticence to share. Sometimes the information's pretty sensitive. So there does need to be some kind of support on this liability issue if companies really are going to be forthcoming with the kinds of issues that they're having. So I think it's important actually to have that protection.
And I think it goes back to Denise. The ISAC plays such a big role in creating that buffer zone, if you will.
Exactly. What the ISACs do is they actually create aggregation of data and anonymization of data, so that company, if you shared something with the ISAC would report that a member reported. So there's no connection at all whatsoever with the company that was reporting it. And it also gives a sector perspective. So you're not just looking at something that's happening to one company, you're seeing something that may be happening across the sector. And it's very exciting. A lot of times when we see the sharing happen, and this gets a little bit back to trust, is you'll see one company come out and say, hey, we're seeing this. And somebody else will say, oh, yeah, we're seeing that too. And then you see the sharing start to happen. And one thing I didn't really get into, but was the fact that we're not just sharing indicators of information. I think people think that, but they're also sharing best practices with each other, strategies like, hey, is anybody seeing this? So they're asking questions of each other. So it's much more than just indicators of compromise.
Right, and I think it goes back to the trust factor, because when you have a trust relationship, you talk about a lot more. I mean, it's like any friendship we all have, at a very superficial level. It's how's the kids, how's the wife, but when you really get into it, it's so tell me more about what's going on. Karen, I'm going to put you on the spot because you're probably the only one at the table that really would want to touch this question. So, and is that what really does the legislation address the ISAC piece? Because it sounds like the way Denise talks about it. Now you're a big supporter of them. Obviously, they're doing the job with the legislation kind of is calling for.
Well, and I think what the legislation is trying to do is get to this gap to the industries that don't necessarily nicely fit into an ISAC type of vertical, right? And so it's talking about there's a whole bunch of industry, small businesses, mid-sized companies that aren't considered quote unquote critical infrastructure or part of the ISAC. And that's where this whole concept of DHS rolling out the ISAOs, right? So that communities of interest would come together. Well, how do they then share the information? And they're not necessarily going to have the protections that an ISAC would have. And then they better follow some of these standards. That's what Jerry was talking about earlier. Like, if I'm going to bring a group of people together, I better know how I'm going to share the information. And I have to have some type of coverage until I can integrate into maybe a formal ISAC or something along the line. So I think the legislation is trying to get to that gap, because we're seeing that now information sharing is starting to get, should I use the word, but stovepiped with these different types of activities underway. And so it's almost now created a bureaucracy so that you don't necessarily get the sharing that you need.
One of the things about the maturation, though, is not just the ISACs and the ISAOs, but the small and mid-sized companies. Let me turn to you, Todd, for a second. Is the FBI starting to work differently with those other companies? I mean, because you're not just working for big guys like Jerry and Viasat, right?
No, correct. I mean, through our InfraGuard program, all level sizes of companies can come and participate in those programs. And one way that I was seeing the process mature through one of the SIG groups, not only, as we were talking earlier, Denise was saying that we are sharing of information, but one big thing that I saw take place with the InfraGard, they were forming a group within one of the special interest groups that would focus on malware, and they were doing their own analysis of malware on the fly down at the Houston InfraGard in particular. So, and within relationship amongst government and industry, the InfraGard program allows the industry individuals to start knowing one another and sharing their own trusted relationships and sharing with each other. So I think when we go through the whole trusted relationship conversation, we just have to remember it's a relationship. You develop the relationship first, and then the trust comes, as in any other relationship in any program that we work, within the FBI.
Denise.
I was going to mention, too, within the ISACs, they're also looking at the small and medium-sized businesses. FS-ISAC, in particular, took it upon themselves to really create a special interest group within the ISAC for community banks and credit unions, which are the smaller. And they actually have a very low barrier to entry for that, to get all that information. And also, quite frankly, during the DDoS attacks of 2012, 2013, we actually, within the industry, had people fly out to some of the smaller institutions that were impacted because they happened to have a similar name and weren't exactly the exact target. So, and they got hit hard, obviously. So they really do take it upon themselves to look out for their smaller brethren within their sector.
And Jerry, let me turn to you, because a lot of times industry gets a bad rap, from government people saying they don't do enough or they're not doing the basics. The maturation, when you talk about cyber threat information sharing, is the relationship building and trust, which we've talked a lot about, but there's more to it than that as well.
Well, certainly. I think, one of the things that, we're a technology company, and so we'll get what we can get, and then we start thinking, well, what can we do about it, right? And so as a security company, a technology company, we're starting to develop our own technologies to address it, and you look and see what you can buy to help you, and then you say, well, that's not enough, So we have an analytics group that's starting to look at the traffic. We're building an active defense model for the company, standing up a secure operations center so that all they do all day is just look at this stuff. Those kinds of things, which are part of like an active defense program. Where you're really trying to be more proactive instead of reactive. And maybe smaller companies maybe can't do this, but there might be a role where trusted intermediaries could provide services along these lines that would help the smaller companies be able to do things like this.
Brad.
Yeah, I think that the one thing that we need to remember, though, as we talk about how we're maturing and the new technologies that are out there, and this is a talking point that we have in pretty much any speaking engagement that we're a part of, is that we have to be very careful about the new sexy buzzwords or technologies that are out there.
No,
because
but we like that.
I know, and I know it helps us, makes us feel good about the work that we're doing, but. The reality is, and we work a lot of incidents within the federal government, as well as where we're asked to participate in critical infrastructure engagements as well, and we see a lot of consistent things at any enterprise that we go into where there's an incident that are really fundamental issues that enterprises are experiencing that just have not been addressed, and that includes patching of applications and systems. It includes poor network segmentation, the lack of two-factor authentication, the lack of application whitelisting, and the lack of logging and monitoring. And I know that I'm one of the more technical people at the table right now, and I don't want to get too geeky into these things because I don't know that that everybody in the listening audience would necessarily get what we're talking about here. But these are really fundamental things that any IT organization should have. Be pretty heavily engaged in, or 80 to 90% of the way to actually, having gotten done. And if you're jumping into a lot of new technologies right now, and you haven't taken care of the basics, you're not really going to be making any progress against the adversary.
Karen, I think Brad just repeated all your memos from 2005 to 2009.
I was getting ready to say, here. It's basic, cyber hygiene. Holy smokes. I mean, if you don't get the basics down, you can't do all the other activities. But the other piece that I wanted to bring up, and Brad brought this up earlier in the segments, and we kind of glossed over this. The other issue that's still out there is that there are concerns that when you start getting these large information stores, that the holders of those information stores have to be cognizant of privacy and civil liberties. And I'm sure Denise has a lot in the health area as it relates to that, and we've mentioned it, but I just want to make sure that we don't lose sight of when we're sharing this information, there is another piece to this which deals with the privacy and civil liberties aspect.
And I think that's part of this maturation we're starting to talk about. Todd?
When it goes back to we're talking about the small and mid-sized companies, one thing that the companies can look at is NSA has a targeted white paper out there for targeted mitigation. And, that's a great starting point for them to look at. It has a lot of the basics, covers the basics, security risks that they can do. But we're also seeing, of course, a lot of the companies are covering the basics and they're doing more than the basic. But at the same time, I think that's where the sharing comes in to fill that gap. But I just want to say for the small business, check out the NSA white paper.
And we can link to that on federalnewsradio.com as well. I'm sure it's a public document. Right. Denise, when you talk to the members of the Health ISAC, are they doing some of these basics? Or are they coming to you with questions about these basics? Well, when Brad talked about patching, what does he mean? So
I think the sector is growing in that area. About 2 or 3 years ago, really, they weren't much of a target. And obviously as threats change, that changes people's postures. I find in the healthcare that they're a little behind, or maybe a lot behind finance in their security posture, but finance has had to do it for a long time. So they absolutely can learn from them and do the right things where finance may have stumbled. So it's very important. Obviously, they have HIPAA considerations and privacy considerations. But again, what the ISAC's doing, and Brad kind of mentioned it, is they actually strip bare that information and provide the absolute essential information that someone like Brad would need to have in order to conduct analysis. So, and Jerry, just to be clear, when a company like Viasat shares information with U.S. CERT, for instance, you're not giving them emails. You're not giving them, hey, you sent an email to Karen and they came back and Karen sent you a PDF and the PDF has malware in it. They get what? To be clear.
Well, it varies. I mean, actually, it depends on how. Sometimes things are a lot more severe. You're providing more information. They might be, FBI might be on site, actually helping you at some level. But a lot of times that information is less specific. Anyway, we're sort of cleaning it up before we send it out ourselves. But sometimes, there is sensitive information, and so that becomes kind of a judgment call.
Todd.
And also from the FBI standpoint, when we're doing these investigations, we don't want to take, 44 million customer records that has their personal. We don't want all of that when we do our investigation. We're just there to determine who did it and how they do it, and try to find the attribution. So that's what we're looking for. We're not running through everybody's personnel file and all that stuff because it's unrelated to what we're doing, which is trying to investigate what happened. The only way we would even really concern ourselves with that is if we felt there was a exfil of data, and then we think we may have found that exfil somewhere in the wild, and we would go back to the company, have them compare what we found. Is this your records? Are these yours? That's the way we're looking at that. We're not coming in, gathering everything, and taking advice. We don't want that information. We don't want to hold that information. We don't want to have to create the space to hold it. We just want the indicators of technically what took place here.
And I know we could have a whole conversation on privacy and civil liberties, but we're wrapping up here this last part of the segment here. So we started the conversation with Brad, and we worked kind of our way out. So let's start with Jerry and work our way back. What should people take from this conversation? Where is information threat sharing going short-term, long-term?
Okay, so there was a conversation about basic hygiene. So definitely basic hygiene. Start there. Information sharing, I think from an industry perspective, we'd like to get good real-time data out of what we contribute, stuff that's been sort of anonymized and that we can take action on. And we build on top of of the foundations that we have. So I think people should be thinking about getting their basic hygiene and then figuring out how to get in place, how to get in organizations where the sharing is going on, or how to get maybe some technology so they can receive these feeds and then do something with it.
Todd, from the FBI's perspective.
I think from the FBI's perspective, it's everything we've talked about today. We're seeing a growing number of especially big companies joining some type of group to where they can share information with what has taken place. What have they found after they've broken through that initial perimeter? What did they find in sharing that information amongst the different sectors? I think that's the big push of where we go in the future, is the sharing of information amongst everyone in a timely fashion, but also counting in some of the constraints that go in there in relationship to still wanting to do the investigation at the same time, treating the victim as a victim, the way we handle the individuals who we're getting the information from.
Brad, you're about to get a lot busier. Tell us what that means for you.
Well, okay, so first off, I mean, not to be redundant, but I'll get fired if I don't say this again. Cyber hygiene. That's got to be, that's fundamentally, it's got to be the one thing that people just need to get out of the way right now. I think that we can get into a place, we can get into an analysis paralysis here with, what is the impact of liabilities? What should I share? What should I not share? And these are all good questions, and we're kind of venturing into new territory, and it's going to take a little while for it to sort of flesh out. I, for one, would not advocate hanging back and just waiting to see what happens. And that's part of who I am as a person, I think. But, I want to be part of the conversation, and I would encourage other people to be part of the conversation as well. And whether that means, finding, your local ISAC and getting involved with your ISAC and understanding what that really means and how it works, or whether that means getting involved in the ISAL or the ISAO conversation, because a lot of that is still being fleshed out right now as well. I mean, that was the grant was just awarded to the University of Texas San Antonio to flesh out those rules, and there's a lot of conversation that's happening around them, and that is going to sort of dictate where information sharing goes in the future. And so, getting involved in that, I think, is really important right now.
All right, Karen, real quick.
Well, my takeaway is, as all of this matures, you need people with the right skills to be able to do this. And so it's still going to always be about the people and the people being able to do their jobs.
All right, Denise, you get the last word.
I
quickly.
think Pink Floyd said it best. Together we stand, divided we fall.
Excellent. Well, good way to sum it up. And unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. You've been listening to the panel discussion, Information Sharing from Compliance to Defense, sponsored by Viasat on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM. I'm your host, Jason Miller. I'd like to thank our guests today. Denise Anderson, the Executive Director of the National Health Information Sharing and Analysis Center. Karen Evans, the National Director of the U.S. Cyber Challenge. Brad Nix, the Deputy Director of the Homeland Security Department's U.S. CERT. Todd Ratcliffe, the Section Chief of Cyber Operations Division for the FBI. And Jerry Goodwin, the Chief Operating Officer of the Government Systems Group of Viasat. For more information on this discussion, visit federalnewsradio.com and search Viasat.
On behalf of Viasat, thank you for joining our discussion. We'll have an archive from this session available shortly, and a link will be sent to you to share with your colleagues. Those of you who requested a training certificate will receive an email with download instructions immediately following the webinar. This concludes today's webinar. Thank you very much.